Jacinda Ardern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, given how particular the Part 1 clauses are, this will be a reasonably short and concise contribution to this part of the debate, but some of the questions that were raised by the last speaker I thought was worthy of response. Now, one of the turns of phrase that he used when talking about the general support that this House has for paid parental leave was that we all support a reasonable amount. Part 1 sets out what a reasonable amount might be from the perspective of actually the majority of the House. And that is based on an evidence base rather than a finger in the air test of what might be reasonable. And we've traversed those various reasons why 26 weeks is what is internationally considered a reasonable amount, and obviously for health and wider beneficial reasons. But, Mr. Speaker, Part 1 sets out then how we would stage towards those 26 weeks. Now, one of the other members in this House just raised the question as to why it was only 26 weeks, why not 12 months? Well, that actually proves a point that Labor has been trying to make throughout this debate. Part 1 is not staged to 12 months because of financial considerations. It's Labor's policy that in an ideal world would be where Part 1 would take us, in fact Part 2, which takes us all the way through to 26. But we have taken into account issues that were raised on the other side of the House around the financial viability of going to that point at this stage, and fell after consideration on a staged approach that first said, let's at least get to 26 weeks, which is why Part 1 takes us first to 18 and then beyond. But, Mr. Speaker, covering off, because so many people have raised in Part 1 the costings question, which is relevant to Part 1, I do want to just clarify that from MB themselves, they have anticipated the cost of the first staging of this bill to be roughly 0.7% of the additional net spending budgeted for 2016-17. So it seems completely inconsistent to me to hear from that side of the House that there is an issue around the affordability of Part 1, when in question time today we had Jerry Brownlee, when asked by our finance spokesperson about the $20 billion, I believe it was roughly, required for the Defence Force, as to whether he'd spoken to Bill English about that massive amount of spending. And if I remember correctly, his words were that there was an absolutely stupendous surplus that was available to the government because of their pristine financial management, which meant that it was possible that $20 billion could be invested in the Defence Force. So how is it that we do not have enough within the budget to allow Part 1 to be enacted, 0.1% of spending relative to the 2016-17 budget, but on the flip side, we not only can afford $20 billion for the Defence Force, we can also afford tax cuts next budget as well. So this is not an issue of not being in Part 1.
I'm going to ask the member to narrow up.
Just to respond to the issue that's being raised there. But also, I want to come to the work contact hours. No one has raised so far that within Part 1, we did originally have a raft of provisions around maintaining work contact hours during parental leave. It is not being removed because that is not a good provision. It has been removed because that was picked up in the government's bill, where they extended paid parental leave to 18 weeks after, of course, we'd had this debate in the House extensively prior, which led, of course, the government to finally accepting that the general public wanted to see that extension. So that's why those provisions, I think rightly so, have been removed. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that we could talk at other great lengths about the trade-offs, the cost that comes with not having paid parental leave that aren't factored into MB's calculations. We could talk at great lengths around the different stages of development for a baby, from 18 to 22 weeks. But actually, Part 1, essentially all it's doing is setting out the phasing in of those two stages of paid parental leave. It's a very narrow part, and I think probably everything that needs to be debated has. Clearly, on this side of the House, there are simply different priorities, and that is why we have prioritised the idea that this could be done, it could be staged, and it could essentially be made effective if the government wanted.
Sarah Dow.